medieval world, pain was not an accident of cruelty. It was a philosophy, a language, and at times a kind of twisted sacrament. To walk through the courts, monasteries, and marketplaces of early Europe was to enter a realm where suffering was woven into the fabric of justice, where agony could be sanctified, and where the body itself became a battlefield between truth and deception. It is difficult for modern minds to comprehend how deeply this belief ran. Yet for the men and women of the Middle Ages, torment was not simply a method, it was a moral instrument sharpened by faith, fear, and the unquestioned authority of divine judgment. The medieval courtroom often resembled a stage on which humanity's darkest instincts disguised themselves as righteous necessity. Judges spoke of pain with the same detachment a physician might use when describing a cure. Clerics preached that suffering purified the stain of sin, as if a scream could rinse the soul clean. Kings and sheriffs wielded torment like iron signatures, harsh marks of power that reminded every subject of their fragile place beneath the crown. The paradox was unmistakable. The same civilization that erected cathedrals reaching for heaven engineered devices that dragged human bodies violently toward the earth. To them, truth was not revealed through reason or evidence, but torn from flesh. If a suspect denied guilt, the assumption wasn't innocence, it was resistance. Truth was expected to bleed its way out. A confession wrung from agony was considered divine confirmation, not moral corruption. And so medieval society created an environment where pain became a currency that courts spent freely, convinced it bought clarity and justice. This belief didn't live on the fringes, it lived in the center, pulsing through legal systems, religious dogma, and public spectacles designed to remind the masses that suffering and order were inseparable companions. Fear did more than control, it educated. Children grew up watching chained figures dragged toward waiting implements. Market stalls paused as executioners demonstrated their craft. Public squares transformed into theaters of warning, where citizens were taught that obedience meant survival. These displays weren't random acts of brutality, they were carefully orchestrated rituals intended to reinforce hierarchy. The church used torment to expose heresy, the state used it to silence rebellion, communities used it to draw boundaries between belonging and exile. Every scream, every wound, every broken limb became part of the social structure, a brutal scaffolding that held authority in place. Yet beneath this calculated cruelty lay a deeper psychological truth. Medieval Europe was terrified of chaos, of hidden sins, of invisible devils whispering in the dark. Terrified of what they did not understand, disease, storms, famine, all of which demanded explanations. And when answers could not be found in nature, they were carved into bodies. Pain functioned as a desperate attempt to impose order on an unpredictable world. The devices forged in smithy fires were not born solely from sadism, they were born from desperation, an attempt to force the universe to reveal its secrets by breaking the people who threatened its fragile stability. The belief that torment could cleanse or uncover truth created a blueprint for innovation. Dark innovation. Blacksmiths weren't merely crafting metal, they were crafting ideology into physical form. Rulers weren't commissioning tools of punishment, they were commissioning symbols of psychological domination. Each device was an argument made in steel, a claim that suffering could perfect society. These machines did not exist because one mad mind desired them. They existed because thousands accepted them, supported them, or feared them too deeply to question their purpose. That is why the medieval world produced instruments capable of peeling flesh, crushing bone, and unraveling the human form with terrifying precision. They were expressions of a worldview in which morality and brutality coexisted without contradiction. A worldview where the same hands that shaped stained glass windows also tightened ropes, heated irons, and constructed chambers designed to swallow cries whole. Civilization and cruelty, instead of opposing forces, became partners, each strengthening the other as we begin this journey into the 10 devices that defined medieval sanctioned suffering. It's essential to understand that these machines were not isolated nightmares. They were manifestations of a society convinced that pain could maintain order and that authority needed to be felt as much as obeyed. Each device you will soon encounter emerged from this crucible of fear, faith, and power. They are the inevitable offspring of a culture that believed the road to truth and purity was paved with broken bodies. And so we step forward, leaving behind the philosophical landscape and moving toward the physical creations it birthed, beginning with the earliest, most symbolic instruments that shaped an era obsessed with controlling both flesh and spirit. In the Middle Ages, fear was not merely a sentiment, it was a tool, a lubricant for the machinery of society, and the raw material from which order was forged. Medieval minds did not approach torture as casual cruelty. They approached it as science, theology, and law entwined. Each instrument of suffering was conceived with deliberate intention, calibrated to extract confession, assert dominance, or demonstrate divine will. This was an era in which morality and mechanics coalesced. The executioner's workshop became a laboratory, the courtroom a theater, and the instruments themselves, both instruments of punishment and symbols of ideological authority. Legal codes across Europe codified pain as an acceptable method to reveal truth. Judges, operating under the belief that human nature was corruptible, permitted and at times demanded the use of suffering to expose hidden sins. Torture was rationalized as both protective and preventative. A confession wrung from fear was seen as evidence of guilt, and even the innocent could be sacrificed to the illusion of societal order. Each application of agony was defended by scripture, canon law, and precedent, forming a lattice of moral justification for acts that would appear monstrous to later generations. Religion played a decisive role in legitimizing these horrors. Clerics argued that torment purified the soul, forcing sinners to confront hidden sins, both earthly and eternal. The inquisitor, torch in hand, could justify stretching, crushing, or branding as a holy duty. Fire, rope, and iron became extensions of God's judgment. Pain was a language through which the divine spoke. Yet the sophistication of these devices, ratchets, spikes, and wheels, revealed that faith alone did not create them. Human ingenuity, technical knowledge, and a meticulous understanding of anatomy guided their design. Fear, though cloaked in piety, was honed with the precision of an engineer. The minds of those who crafted and operated these machines were a study in paradox. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and metalworkers were summoned not merely for skill, but for imagination, the creativity required to transform simple materials into mechanisms capable of controlling flesh. Executioners, often socially marginalized yet revered in their professional domain, understood anatomy and leverage in a way that few physicians did. They were taught to apply force, calculate pain thresholds, and anticipate human reactions. Their expertise was not celebrated. It was feared, yet their work was essential to the functioning of courts, castles, and inquisitions alike. Warfare and political instability accelerated this engineering. Armies required methods to intimidate enemies, secure loyalty, and extract information quickly. Towns under siege or rulers facing rebellion looked to instruments of torture as a means to consolidate power with minimal troop expenditure. The same device that could compel a confession from a suspected heretic could also terrify a population into obedience. Efficiency, precision, and psychological impact became intertwined goals. No longer was torture simply punishment, it was propaganda, deterrent, and administration rolled into one. Even curiosity played a subtle role. Scholars and natural philosophers of the time, observing human anatomy without the ethical restraints of later centuries, found in these devices a grotesque experimentation with physical and psychological limits. Stretching a limb or tightening a screw offered data on human endurance, pain thresholds, and physiological responses. Religion, law, and warfare provided justification, but behind the scenes lurked an undeniable scientific fascination. Pain became both instrument and object of study, and each new device pushed boundaries further. Refining the blend of efficiency and terror, materials dictated possibilities. Wood was carved, reinforced, and bound. Iron was forged into spikes, chains, and clamps. Rope became a conduit for suspension and strain. Fire transformed simple confinement into extreme agony. Each element was adapted to multiply suffering while minimizing the labor required of the operator. These were not crude contraptions. They were calculated, mechanical statements of authority, each designed to leave a visible, indelible impression of power. The very selection of materials, their arrangement, and the mechanics involved spoke of a culture obsessed with control, punishment, and spectacle. The institutionalization of torture transformed it into a societal expectation. It was no longer a private act of cruelty, but a public, regulated procedure. Manuals instructed officials on methodology, thresholds, and sequencing. Techniques were passed down through generations, refined in workshops, documented in legal texts. A torture session was as much an orchestrated performance as it was an interrogation. Victims were carefully positioned, tools prepared for maximum effect, and the audience, whether local citizens, officials, or clergy, trained to read the language of suffering as a moral lesson. By combining faith, fear, law, and mechanical precision, medieval societies created an architecture of terror that permeated everyday life. These instruments were not anomalies. They were logical extensions of a worldview, where order required pain and authority demanded proof through suffering. The stage was set, the tools ready, and the minds behind them honed for decades of experimentation and implementation. It is from this convergence of morality and mechanics, piety and precision, that the devices of medieval torment emerged. Each upcoming instrument is a testament to this dark synthesis, a chilling reminder that in these societies, innovation was often measured in screams, and engineering could be as cruel as it was brilliant. With understanding of the mechanics of fear now established, we can begin our descent into the first devices, each a physical manifestation of a civilization that turned human agony into art. The rack stands as one of the earliest and most notorious instruments of medieval terror, a deceptively simple frame of wood and rope capable of bending the human body into grotesque distortion. Suspended between two rollers, the victim's wrists and ankles were fastened and slowly pulled apart, joint by joint, tendon by tendon. A confession could be drawn from a single rotation of the rollers, and yet the tormentor's patience dictated the extent of suffering. In courts across Europe, the rack was more than a device. It was an adjudicator, a silent judge whose verdict was etched in torn flesh and shattered bones. It was employed against thieves, heretics, and political enemies alike, each victim an unwilling participant in the ritual of revelation. The pain was not instantaneous but calculated, a methodical unraveling of the human form designed to extract truth with terrifying precision. The Iron Maiden, by contrast, elevated cruelty into a perverse form of artistry. A coffin-like enclosure lined with spikes awaited its occupant, the doors closing slowly until the body was impaled in multiple points. Simultaneously, legends of its invention suggest that fear of confession and theatrical intimidation motivated its design. Victims were often accused of blasphemy or treachery, their screams echoing through stone chambers, while the outside world watched in morbid fascination. The Iron Maiden was never merely functional, it was performative. Its very presence conveyed authority and divine judgment. Those who gazed upon it were reminded that transgression, no matter how secret, could be made tangible, visible, and inescapable. Then there was the Judas cradle, a device so grotesque in concept that its simplicity belied its horrors. The victim was hoisted above a pointed pyramid, and gravity became the instrument of punishment. Slowly lowered, the body impaled itself, often for hours, until the mind fractured under the inevitability of continued agony. It was less about immediate death and more about the drawn-out assertion of dominance. Its design, attributed to inquisitors seeking both confession and deterrence, reflected the medieval obsession with methodical suffering. The Judas cradle demonstrates the paradox of these devices. The closer one approached salvation through confession, the deeper one sank into torment. Faith, law, and cruelty intertwined in a single pointed principle, that pain could illuminate truth. Beyond these iconic devices, countless others populated castles, courts, and dungeons. The thumbscrew crushed fingers with merciless precision. The scavenger's daughter compressed bodies into metal frameworks. The wheel could twist limbs into unnatural angles, leaving bodies as public exemplars of obedience and failure. Each instrument was carefully designed to target vulnerability, exploiting human anatomy with clinical understanding. Executioners often measured their victims' endurance, learning over time how the human form responded to strain, pressure, and fear. These were not improvisations, they were systematic, almost scientific explorations of the limits of suffering. Historical records reveal the context for these horrors. Inquisition trials, political purges, and criminal interrogations all relied on the theatrical display of suffering. Public spectacle magnified their impact. Communities watched, absorbed, and internalized the lesson that law was inseparable from pain. The rack could produce immediate confessions, yet victims often survived only to bear permanent deformities, their lives a testament to both guilt and innocence intertwined in the grotesque calculus of justice. The Iron Maiden's victims often died slowly, their demise as much a warning as an execution, while the Judas cradle exemplified the terrifying patience that medieval authorities could exercise. The psychological dimension of these devices cannot be overstated. Fear was engineered into every detail. The sound of stretching, the sight of spikes, the slow inevitability of gravity, all carefully orchestrated to break resistance before the body completely succumbed. Pain became a medium of communication, conveying the supremacy of law, church, or crown. And yet, paradoxically, society viewed these horrors as necessary instruments of morality. The same hands that built cathedrals installed racks and spikes. The same minds that contemplated divine salvation measured the tensile strength of rope and bone. Civilization and cruelty were inseparable, bound together in a grim ballet that turned agony into an instrument of order. One of the most haunting aspects is how normalized these instruments became. Manuals instructed torturers on procedure, timing, and sequencing. In some regions, entire workshops specialized in crafting new methods, refining existing designs, and innovating mechanisms for efficiency. Each iteration sought to maximize compliance while minimizing operator effort, a mechanical elegance entwined with moral horror. Victims were not always criminals. Sometimes they were scapegoats, political pawns, or victims of superstition. Yet the principle remained consistent. The body was both a vessel of truth and a canvas for authority. As these instruments proliferated, society accepted them as extensions of justice itself. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the Judas cradle, and countless others exemplified the intersection of law, faith, and cruelty. They were embodiments of a worldview in which human suffering was not only permissible but necessary, where confession and punishment were inseparably entwined, and where terror became a tool to enforce both obedience and belief. Each device set the stage for the next level of horror, the psychological manipulation that accompanied and often exceeded the physical brutality. The engines of agony reveal the terrifying reality of medieval justice, that human creativity, faith, and law could converge to produce suffering with both precision and performative grandeur. The first wave of torture devices reminds us that cruelty was systematized, studied, and celebrated as a form of governance. With this foundation, we can now turn toward the darker layers of human manipulation, exploring the psychological contradictions that allowed societies to justify horrors that modern eyes can barely endure. In medieval society, the line between justice and theater was deliberately blurred. Torture was rarely confined to dimly lit dungeons or private chambers. It was performed as public ritual, a spectacle meant to instruct, intimidate, and affirm the social order. Town squares, churchyards, and castle courtyards became stages where agony played out under the watchful eyes of citizens, clergy, and nobility alike. The sound of a crackling fire, the creak of a rack, or the metallic rasp of a wheel became familiar as a civic language, a grim grammar of obedience and punishment. Witnessing such events was not optional. It was a form of participation, a social lesson etched into memory with terror as its ink. The psychological logic behind these spectacles was meticulous. Observers learned that transgression, whether moral, legal, or religious, carried consequences beyond imagination. Pain was pedagogical, its methodology as important as its effect. Devices such as the heretic's fork, wedged between chin and chest to immobilize the head, and the breaking wheel, which twisted limbs into unnatural angles, transformed interrogation into performance. The victim became both lesson and medium, their suffering narrating the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Confession, often extorted under these conditions, was thus a public event, confirming the righteousness of authority while shattering the dignity of the condemned religion, provided the moral scaffolding for this theater of pain. Clerics justified spectacle as divine pedagogy. Punishment was sacred, intended to cleanse souls and demonstrate God's omnipotence. Heretics, witches, and sinners were portrayed as vessels of corruption, and the instruments of their torment were consecrated as tools of spiritual warfare. When an inquisitor ordered the tightening of a chain, the suspension of a body, or the impalement of a limb, it was interpreted as the tangible intervention of divine justice. Spectators internalized the lesson. Sin had visible consequences, and sacred law demanded its enforcement through the human body. Political motives intertwined seamlessly with religious justification. Rulers understood that fear was a currency, one that could consolidate power without armies or taxes. Public execution served to signal both wrath and mercy. The ruler's hand could destroy or forgive, and this duality reinforced authority. The same wheel that shattered bones in one town might be observed by visiting dignitaries or merchants, spreading the message of control far beyond the immediate locale. Pain became portable, repeatable, and symbolic, a visible proof of societal hierarchy. The citizen, forced to witness, absorbed the logic. Submission equated survival. Resistance guaranteed annihilation. Spectacle shaped perception as effectively as it inflicted injury. The mechanics of fear were amplified through ritualized processions, dramatic posturing, and timing designed to maximize anticipation. Executioners and clerics understood the emotional arc. Terror first, awe second, instruction always. The cries of the condemned, though horrifying, were part of the lesson. The audience learned the narrative of consequence without ever touching the instruments themselves. The process transformed private suffering into communal experience, binding society to the ideology of controlled terror. The moral contradictions were stark. Pain was justified as divine or civic necessity, yet it was consumed as entertainment. Children watched alongside adults. Townsfolk gossiped about the grotesque details. Merchants paused their trade to observe and internalize the lesson. Fear became a shared emotion, communal in its reach, yet intensely personal in its effect. Social cohesion was maintained not through empathy or consent, but through the normalization of brutality. Spectators were conditioned to accept that suffering was not only deserved but instructive, that enjoyment of horror could coexist with the affirmation of moral order. Inquisitors and executioners capitalized on this cognitive dissonance. The heretic's fork immobilized heads with a precision that intensified mental agony, while the breaking wheel displayed bodies contorted into geometries of punishment. These devices were as much about forcing confession as they were about demonstrating dominion over the human form. Their presence in public spaces blurred lines between justice, vengeance, and amusement. Citizens learned to anticipate the mechanisms of pain as a predictable extension of law and faith, internalizing terror as both moral guide and social glue. The cultural embrace of torture as spectacle also facilitated innovation. Craftsmen were motivated to refine, embellish, and optimize instruments to achieve maximum psychological and physical effect. Each device evolved to produce more precise agony, more dramatic display, and more unambiguous instruction. Fear was engineered with the same care as a cathedral arch, every element calculated to awe, intimidate, and educate. Ordinary spectators were unwitting participants in a system that normalized cruelty, and this shared conditioning reinforced the infrastructure of terror across generations. By converting punishment into performance, medieval societies reconciled morality with brutality. Torture was sacred duty and popular theater, divine justice and political messaging, ethical obligation and entertainment. This duality, simultaneously horrific and necessary, laid the groundwork for the most extreme devices yet to come. Understanding the cultural and psychological logic behind these spectacles prepares the mind for the forbidden instruments that would push the boundaries of cruelty and probe the darkest recesses of human endurance. Among the myriad instruments of medieval torment, there exists a subset so intimate, so calculated, and so deeply personal that even contemporaries sometimes recoiled from their use. These were devices designed not only to punish, but to dominate identity, sexuality, and the very essence of self. While the Rack or the Iron Maiden terrorized broadly, the forbidden instruments were surgical in their cruelty, targeting bodies and minds with a precision that reflected societal anxieties about morality, obedience, and the regulation of deviance. To confront them is to witness a civilization attempting to control the human body as the ultimate route to controlling the soul. The breast ripper exemplifies the intersection of fear, gendered violence, and ritualized punishment. Forged from iron and equipped with clawed, ratchet-like edges, it was designed to tear flesh from the chest of women accused of adultery, heresy, or defiance. Its use was slow, deliberate, a calculated escalation of terror that made both the physical and symbolic consequences unbearable. Beyond the immediate agony, the Ripper sent a clear message. Female transgression was not only sinful but visible, punishable in the most intimate parts of the body. Its design reflected medieval anxieties about sexuality and purity, transforming the female form into a canvas for moral instruction enforced by pain. The Spanish donkey, equally grotesque in intention, transformed a simple piece of wood into a tool of unimaginable torment. Victims were positioned astride a sharpened triangular plank, often with weights attached to amplify the pressure on the pelvis, male or female. The device was intended to punish perceived licentiousness, theft, or defiance, converting private shame into public horror. Pain radiated not only physically but psychologically, leaving victims broken in ways that reshaped their identity, their reputation, and their very sense of safety in the world. The donkey was a brutal reinforcement of hierarchical authority. Those who defied societal norms would be forced into submission through intimate violation. The Pear of Anguish represents another disturbing innovation. Small, metallic, and insidiously simple, it expanded within orifices when a screw mechanism was turned, tearing tissue and inducing incomprehensible pain. Its victims were often accused of heresy, sexual impropriety, or speech considered dangerous to social or religious order. What makes the pear particularly horrifying is its symbolic purpose. It converted fear of the body into control over confession and obedience. In the mind of the inquisitor, the device justified itself. If the body bent and yielded, so too would the soul. Resistance became anatomically impossible, a physical testament to the supremacy of authority. The Scavenger's daughter, less widely known but equally merciless, compressed the body into a crouched, immobilized position, forcing knees, elbows, and spine into unnatural angles. This device applied constant pressure, often leading to broken bones, ruptured muscles, and suffocation, all without the spectacle of blades or spikes. Its horror lay in the inversion of the human form, bodies contorted into submission, identity literally reshaped to enforce obedience. Unlike more publicized devices, the Scavenger's daughter was often used privately, reinforcing the idea that personal humiliation and bodily domination could serve as tools for social control, quietly terrorizing the accused and warning others by reputation rather than display. Each of these devices reveals a deep cultural anxiety, a fear that morality, obedience, and social cohesion depended on controlling the most private aspects of human existence. Torture was no longer simply about extracting confession or punishing crime. It became a mechanism to enforce ideological conformity, regulate sexuality, and assert power over bodies in ways that left no ambiguity about who held authority. The forbidden instruments were intimate in their cruelty, precisely because they targeted what society feared most: the uncontrolled, the disobedient, the morally ambiguous. The personal nature of these instruments also reflects a disturbing intersection of morality and performance. Even when used in private chambers, the narrative of punishment spread. Witnesses, records, or rumors ensured that the terror extended beyond the immediate victim. Women were warned that defiance could cost them not only limbs or life, but identity. Men were shown that rebellion could result in intimate mutilation or physical degradation. Pain was therefore both corrective and communicative, a mechanism for reshaping society as much as individuals. Historical accounts confirm that these devices were neither anomalies nor isolated experiments. They were tools embedded in a legal, religious, and social framework that rationalized even the most intimate forms of suffering. Executioners and inquisitors often required specialized skill to operate them, emphasizing precision over brute force. Pain was engineered with surgical deliberation, every twist, squeeze, or expansion calculated to maximize suffering while leaving no possibility of moral ambiguity. The human body became a medium through which law, faith, and societal expectations were inscribed in indelible agony. In addition to their physical cruelty, these instruments highlight the psychological strategies of medieval control. Fear was magnified not only by the anticipation of pain, but by the knowledge that transgression could be identified, punished, and memorialized in the body itself. Confession was not enough. Compliance had to be physically demonstrated, internalized, and remembered. In this sense, the forbidden instruments were as much about conditioning as punishment, converting terror into a mechanism for sustained authority, obedience, and ideological conformity. Ultimately, the forbidden devices exposed the darkest motivations of medieval governance: the obsession with dominance, the conflation of morality with mechanical suffering, and the belief that controlling flesh ensured the salvation or submission of the soul. The breast ripper, the Spanish donkey, the Pear of Anguish, and the Scavenger's daughter exemplify a terrifying principle: that pain could define identity, enforce hierarchy, and erase personal autonomy. They stand as stark reminders that in the medieval worldview, authority was inseparable from the power to inflict intimate, personalized torment. As we leave this descent into the most taboo instruments, the stage is set to witness history's real consequences. The next chapter will examine documented cases where these tools were wielded, lives irrevocably altered, and society's most sacred principles of justice and morality were intertwined with unspeakable cruelty. The forbidden instruments are not merely relics. They are prelude to the human stories that reveal the true cost of medieval fear, faith, and authority. Across the labyrinthine corridors of medieval Europe, the cries of the accused echoed far beyond the stone walls of dungeons and courts. History preserves the names and fates of those who endured the Rack, the Iron Maiden, the Judas Cradle, and the forbidden instruments, each case a testament to the calculated cruelty of authority. These were not abstract horrors, they were lived, bleeding realities. Inquisitors, executioners, and rulers wielded torture as both a method of governance and a statement of divine or political supremacy. Victims became instruments themselves, human witnesses to the ideology of power, their suffering shaping societies as profoundly as laws or treaties. Consider the case of Agnes of Prague, accused of heresy in the early 14th century. Agnes was subjected to prolonged questioning under devices designed to stretch and immobilize, her body contorted against the thresholds of endurance. Confessions, whether true or forced, were recorded and presented as evidence of divine order. Her torment served a dual purpose. It demonstrated the Church's unassailable authority over both belief and body, and it warned communities that deviation from sanctioned doctrine carried consequences that were inescapable. The outcome was as much propaganda as punishment. The display of obedience extracted under duress became a moral template for the faithful, while Agnes's suffering underscored the human cost of institutional control. Political prisoners often faced even more calculated applications of torture. During the late 15th century, a rebellious nobleman in France found himself on the breaking wheel, limbs fractured in deliberate sequence, his cries echoing across the castle courtyard. The spectacle was attended by courtiers and townspeople alike. His punishment was publicized as justification for royal authority, turning a private rebellion into a demonstration of state power. The victim's suffering became a message carved into the collective memory of the kingdom. Resistance could not escape pain, and power was inseparable from fear. The wheels and racks were more than tools. They were instruments of governance. Their efficiency measured not only in confessions but in the widespread psychological imprint they left behind. Women accused of transgression endured horrors, both intimate and socially charged. In Spain, during the height of the Inquisition, a woman named Isabella was condemned for heretical speech and sexual impropriety. The Pear of Anguish and the breast ripper were employed in private, yet their consequences were far from hidden. Isabella's torment was whispered in marketplaces and monasteries alike, her body transformed into a cautionary narrative. The state and the church could penetrate every private space, enforce morality, and redefine obedience through the most intimate of violations. The fear engendered by such punishments extended far beyond the walls of the cell, conditioning communities to conflate compliance with survival and internalizing terror as civic instruction. Rebels, witches, and traitors shared similar fates, though the devices varied according to cultural priorities and political necessity. Accused witches in Germany, for instance, were often suspended and stretched until confessions emerged, admissions that would later justify executions by fire. These confessions, extracted under duress, were codified into legal precedent, shaping witch trials for generations. Torture became a self-perpetuating system. It produced evidence, reinforced authority, and normalized the cycle of suffering. Even as it destroyed bodies, it preserved power, illustrating how human cruelty could be institutionalized without moral accountability. Beyond individual cases, the ripple effects of torture extended across kingdoms and centuries. Legal frameworks evolved to accommodate interrogation as standard procedure, embedding the logic of fear into courts and tribunals. Texts detailing methods, timings, and acceptable thresholds of suffering circulated among officials and clerics, creating a grim continuity in the administration of justice. By codifying cruelty, societies ensured that torture would persist, rationalized as necessary for order, morality, or divine will. The machinery of pain became as structured and systematic as the governance it served, leaving enduring marks on collective consciousness and cultural memory. Some cases reveal the tragic paradox of medieval justice. Confessions obtained through unimaginable pain were treated as both conclusive and sacred, yet the evidence was fundamentally unreliable. Entire inquisitions hinged on testimonies wrung from terror, yet the state presented these as proof of righteousness. Victims were both condemned and celebrated in death, their suffering transformed into ideological currency. Families, communities, and chroniclers absorbed these events, learning that compliance was not only preferable but essential, and that the human body was a pliable vessel for societal demands. Pain became pedagogy, cruelty became ritual, and memory became the instrument through which authority persisted. The historical archive is replete with similar examples. Nobles bent over racks to confess political scheming, artisans crushed by thumbscrews for alleged blasphemy, women and men forced to speak under the shadow of intimate instruments, their stories recorded in meticulous detail. Each account reminds us that the machinery of suffering was deliberate, that it was engineered to reinforce hierarchies, and that it was normalized through repeated exposure. Medieval societies did not regard these acts as aberrations. They were standard procedures embedded in law, faith, and governance. In examining these blood testimonies, a chilling conclusion emerges. The normalization of torture was not born of chaos, but of order. Human ingenuity, faith, and politics converged to rationalize cruelty, creating a system in which suffering was both expected and instructive. The cycle of violence perpetuated itself, leaving a legacy that shaped legal and moral thought for centuries. And while the instruments, rituals, and beliefs of the medieval period may feel distant, the impulse to justify suffering has never disappeared. Humanity's capacity to rationalize cruelty evolves, but the psychological architecture, the tension between authority and human fragility, remains hauntingly consistent. In the end, these cases leave us with a sobering reflection. Torture was not merely an accident of history, but a mirror of human desire to control, categorize, and conquer both body and spirit. The lives broken, the confessions forced, and the memories of agony preserved in chronicles reveal the terrifying consistency of cruelty across time. History's blood testimonies remind us that the rationalization of suffering is as old as civilization itself, and that the human imagination, capable of beauty and innovation, is equally capable of devising mechanisms to inflict horror under the guise of justice, faith, or order.